All right. So if you didn't hear the beginning, my name is Kane. I work in the office at the Finger Lakes Trail Conference, and we're going to talk a little bit about some planning your first backpacking trip on the Finger Lakes Trail, and then we'll get a little bit into kind of the gear that you might use during your first backpacking trip. So I brought up this slide, and I wanted to take a second to talk about some of the backpacking trips I've taken on the Finger Lakes Trail. The most significant one of these is the one that I took in May 2023. It was one of the first backpacking trips that I took on the trail. And it's very near and dear to my heart because it's kind of how I found out about the Finger Lakes Trail Conference. Um, my partner had COVID back in February of 2023. And so I was kind of quarantining away in our bedroom. And I started going kind of stir crazy. And I'd had a little bit of backpacking experience before this, and I decided that in order to help kind of quell my stir craziness, I was going to start planning a backpacking trip. So I live out in Rochester, and when I started looking online for places to go backpacking near Rochester, there just didn't seem to be that much. And I eventually found the Finger Lakes National Forest and found that that was a place where you could go, hike in, stay the night, and hike back out. And I was like, oh, that's great. And then I started realizing, oh, it's actually connected to something called the Finger Lakes Trail. And that's how I found out about the trail itself. I started planning this trip and it just started slowly getting longer and longer. And this is not what I recommend for kind of an early backpacking trip for people. Usually I recommend do just one overnight with kind of short mileage on either end. But it turned into this kind of 5 day, 4 night, about 50 miles long backpacking trip. And I eventually did take that trip in late May of 2023. I did the first 2 days solo, and then my partner and a couple of friends joined me for the last 3 days. And I ended up loving that trip so much that I wanted to get involved with the Finger Lakes Trail Conference and with the trail. And the rest is kind of history. This is a little map of kind of what that trip was. So it started at the north end of the Finger Lakes National Forest, taking the Interlochen Trail down to where it connects with the main Finger Lakes Trail. Day two was really cool because I got to walk through the town of Watkins Glen. I stayed the night at one of the campsites in Watkins Glen State Park, and then continued along the main trail until I got to the Crystal Hills branch on the last day, and I took a little bit of the Crystal Hills branch south to where we had our end car parked. So I might come back and reference a couple of these trips at various times during the during us talking about kind of planning a backpacking trip. But let's go ahead and start actually talking about planning a backpacking trip on the Finger Lakes Trail. When I go and think about planning a backpacking trip, the first thing I think about is the dates. So there are very obvious things about picking a date for a backpacking trip. When are you free and available to go on a backpacking trip? You might also want to think about things like, do you want a rest day after your trip? Things like that. But you also want to keep in mind things like the weather. For a first backpacking trip, I wouldn't recommend going out when there's possibility that it might get really cold at night. So I might want to stick to some of the warmer months. That'll also help you avoid some of the hunting closures along the trail. So sometime like June, July, August. And once you have some dates in mind, you can start looking at general locations. So I usually look at things like trail closures, where there are a lot of trail closures and where can I avoid those. I like to think about the seasonal conditions depending on the dates that I chose. Is it going to be really, really hot, like sometime in mid-July? And I might want to avoid places with a lot of unshaded roadwalks where it's going to be a little bit miserable for a bunch of miles, kind of walking down the road. Um, you might also want to check and see if there are any special events going on in the area you're thinking about backpacking. There was one backpacking trip I took where I started the trip and I was walking along and I started seeing a lot of like little flags along the trail, and I was like, oh, that's weird. I haven't seen these flags before. I guess this must be like the course for some kind of event. Okay. And I kept walking, and then I saw some people setting up one of those kind of canopy tent things along the side of the road as I came out of the woods, and I was like, oh, I wonder what's going on there. And I didn't really start putting things together until I saw another canopy tent, and I started getting passed by a bunch of runners, and I realized that it was the Twisted Branch ultra marathon was happening on the same day and in the same part of the trail that I was hiking. Ended up totally fine. It was kind of fun to, stand aside and get passed by all these people running down the trail and doing a ton more miles than than I was going to be doing that day. And I actually camped. That was on M12, and I camped near the June Bug Trail. There's a little campsite there, and like all into the kind of like late evening. I think even past like 10 p.m. I was hearing runners go by as they were like trying to finish their ultra marathon. I think the deadline for it might have been midnight. So it was kind of amazing. It was a cool experience, but definitely something to be aware of if that's not the vibe you're going for your backpacking trip. The other thing about picking a location would be transportation concerns. So making sure that there is adequate parking or figuring out a way to get dropped off and picked up for your trip. Um, I usually, I've been very, very lucky, and I have supportive friends and a supportive partner who have definitely driven a lot of miles to just pick me up from my car and bring me to the start of my backpacking trip. That's my preferred method. It's awesome when I can do that. Um, but there are also places where you can try and make a loop on the trail with different kind of other spur trails and things like that. Or you can definitely do an out and back. Back to my slides here. Okay. So once you have kind of a general location where you might want to take your backpacking trip, it's starting to start actually planning a route. So instead of going through, also, by the way, these slides I actually have available if you want to download them, follow along, or kind of reference them the after our presentation here. So I've just put that link in the chat for everybody if you want to take a look at the slides. But I figured we'd actually go and open the Finger Lakes Trail interactive map. So I'm going to pretend like I am actually sitting down and planning a backpacking trip that I'd be taking. I would not be backpacking in the current weather. It's a little bit too cold for me. So I'm going to pretend it's like September or something. And I'm thinking about somewhere kind of near Rochester where I live. So probably somewhere we're here on the west side of the trail. And let's say that I've landed on somewhere on M5. So this is somewhere around this Farmersville area. So I'm actually kind of going through the process of planning a backpacking trip that I took this past September. That was a really nice trip. And I looked around, I figured I wanted to do just one night. And I was actually going to be joined by a couple of my friends. And the first thing that I looked for is campsites. So when I'm going around and looking, we have these nice little symbols for different campsites. You can click on them, get a little bit more information. There's also some information on the Finger Lakes Trails website about all of the different campsites along the trail. They have markers for, private campgrounds that might be a couple of miles off the trail, or there are also some, lean-tos along the trail and some bivy sites and tent sites. So to learn more about any particular campsite, you just have to click on it from the map or go to that one web page that I think I'm going to reference in a later slide. I'm starting to jump around a little bit. Let's go back to just distance. So once you kind of have a general idea of the area, you want to figure out how much distance you'll hike. So if I'm doing a 1 night overnight, that means I'm going to be hiking in, camping 1 night, and then hiking out. And assuming that I have a very nice partner or friend who is willing to drive me and help me drop off my car where I plan to end, and then drive me to the start of the of where I want to start hiking. I can do, kind of two different legs instead of doing an out and back. So assuming that we can do two different legs here, let's go back to our map. We can camp here. So we want to figure out how much distance on this side for day one and how much distance on this side for day two, assuming that we're hiking east. I start by looking at how much daylight there's going to be and also thinking about how early I actually want to get up. I am not very good at getting up really early, so it's actually probably going to be more restrained by the time that I actually want to get up. It's about an hour and a half drive to get down uh, to this area from where I live, and say about half an hour kind of transferring cars and all this other kind of stuff. So that's 2 hours. So if I get up at 7:30, I can maybe start hiking by 9:30. I would want to get to camp with, say, about 2 hours before sunset. So that means a little bit of time for me to set up my tent, for me to eat a meal before it gets truly dark outside. And it's never fun to be setting up a tent or eating in the dark. I learned about eating in the dark the hard way. Uh, I flew a little bit too kind of close to the sun or to sunset at one point for one of my backpacking trips. I got into camp a little bit late and I ended up eating my dinner kind of in the dark, and I had my headlamp on, even in red light mode. And for whatever reason, wherever I was, there were just some very large and very aggressive moths that didn't want to fly into my face, but definitely did want to fly directly into the reflective pouch out of which I was eating my meal. And so after two or three moths went into my meal, I was like, I think I might be done. I don't know if I can continue to eat this particular food. I had some extra food. It wasn't, the end of the world, but definitely not an experience I'd want to repeat. So trying to get to camp with some daylight left is pretty important for my backpacking trips. So say that I can start hiking at 9:30 in the morning and sunset's at about 7:30, so I want to get there with 2 hours to spare. That means 9:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. That's 8 hours of time I could potentially be hiking. I'm definitely not going to be hiking straight for 8 hours. I'm kind of a slow backpacker. I don't move very fast. I like to take a lot of breaks. I like to take my time on the trail. So I kind of throw in some time, say an hour for lunch and 2 hours for other kind of breaks, slow downs, what have you. And from experience, I know that, a more fast pace, kind of easy trail, road walks, I can go about 2 miles an hour. But for, elevation changes, kind of difficult to traverse trail, it's probably going to be a little bit slower. So say a mile and a half an hour. From there, I have kind of my range of the distance that I think I can cover on day one. So on a good day, maybe 10 miles. On a not as great day, maybe 7.5. And I do the same thing for day two and kind of have that range in my mind as I start looking at where is my start point and where is my end point for my trip. So for this particular trip, it ended up being camping here at this tent site in the middle of M5. And I was able to actually complete this entire map. So we started here at Access 1, and we stayed at this tent site, and the next day we hiked out. There's a bit of a long road walk and a little bit of hiking at the end, and we ended up at the last access point for M5, or the first access point for M6 on the main trail. Your kind of estimates for how fast you might hike, how much of a break you might want, that's all going to differ from person to person. And it kind of doing this narrative method is the best way for me to figure out a general itinerary and a general plan for what my day is going to look like as I'm backpacking. This, there's a little bit of wiggle room here, and it's just going to look a little bit different for everybody, but this is kind of my preferred method of thinking about what my day is going to look like. A little bit about picking a campsite. Um, I usually stick to the lean-tos and any designated campsites that are marked on the FLT interactive map. There's usually a lot more information about the campsites themselves on the actual maps that you go and buy from the Finger Lakes Trail Conference. There are some areas where dispersed camping might be allowed, so going out and camping, I think it's 150 feet away from trails and water sources in certain New York State forests and things like that, but you'd want to check that before you go. It's just easier to stick to the designated campsites. There are also lots of places on the trail where the trail grows on private property, and you don't want to think that you're on, state forest land, and it turns out you're on private property and have a whole situation of trespassing on someone's land. We talked about the interactive map. And you also want to check what is at any particular campsite before you plan to camp there. So you want to see if there's a water source nearby that campsite. You might want to see if there's a fire ring, if having a campfire is something that's really important to you. You might want to see if there's a privy at that campsite. All those sorts of things are usually listed right there on the interactive map. General planning for food. You want to make sure that you have enough food for all the days that you will be out hiking, plus one extra day. I use a bear canister to store my food. I have my, oh, that does not show up when I'm sharing my screen. Give me 1 second. There we go. So I have my bear canister here. This is a bear-proof container, or very, very bear-resistant container, hopefully. So I put my food in here, and I walk this at least 100 feet away from where I cooked any food when I'm camping and from where I'm sleeping. And that will help protect my food and me from not just bears, but kind of any critters that might be interested in smelly food or smelly really anything. So other things that might go in here are things like insect repellent or sunscreen, anything that has a scent to it that could be associated with humans and human activity. An alternative to this is to do a bear hang. So hanging up your food high up on a line between two trees, something like that. I have friends that do bear hangs and have done bear hangs on Finger Lakes trail trips that we've taken before. But having my bear canister, while it's a little bit heavier, means that I don't have to spend the like 45 minutes trying to find a good spot for a bear hang, getting the bear hang set up, getting all the knots tied, getting that whole process done. And I just have to walk my bear canister, 100 feet in some direction, and it's over and it's done. And it's just one less thing that I have to worry about when I get to camp and while I'm camping. So my personal preference is a bear canister, but people definitely do bear hangs. You might do a rodent hang in areas where you're not super worried about bears specifically. A rodent hang is like an easier bear hang, where a bear maybe could get that food, but probably rodents would not be able to. So just a little bit high off the ground. let's see. Back to our screen share here and our slides. For the meals themselves, I usually make sure that I have something for breakfast, something for lunch, something for dinner, and some snacks to eat along the trail. Um, for a one night overnight, like we were talking about planning before, I will probably eat breakfast at home. That means on the trail, I'll have lunch on day one, dinner on day one, any snacks that I want to have on day one, breakfast on day two, and lunch on day two. I also want to bring one full day's worth of extra food. So I bring an extra breakfast, extra lunch, extra dinner. But for me, I usually end up having a couple of Cliff Bars for breakfast, and my lunches usually end up looking a little bit more like kind of a huge handful of a variety of snacks. Usually for lunch, I'll have a bunch of beef jerky and trail mix and nuts, kind of whatever my body feels like it's craving. So instead of making a particular meal for lunch, it's kind of grab and go type stuff for me, but everyone's a little bit different. You should definitely bring whatever feels right to you. Some people, as they get more into backpacking, start making their own dehydrated meals. I have not gotten that far yet, mostly because I am not that good at cooking in general. So I usually, to keep things simple, go into REI and pick out a dehydrated meal where the picture kind of looks like something that I would normally eat in my normal day-to-day life. Um, these dehydrated meals are pretty simple to make. You just boil water and add that water to a pouch, and you let it sit for a certain amount of time, and then you have a meal that's ready to eat. It makes it quick and easy. It's a little bit more reliable than, you know, trying to make something over a campfire. That might be kind of tough, especially if it turns out you actually can't make a campfire in the area that you plan to camp, things like that. And speaking of campfires and cooking food, we should talk a little bit about camp stoves and fuel for those camp stoves. So, when we talk about camp stoves, some people think of these big, almost almost like laptop size, and then a little bit thicker things with like two burners and stuff like that. But and that's what kind of, when people when I started getting into backpacking, people were talking about camp stoves. That is genuinely what popped into my brain, and I was like, "What do you mean you put that in a backpack and you lug it with you through the woods?" And I didn't realize that they have little teeny tiny, very small camp stoves. Let me bring up or stop my screen share once more. There we go. Okay. So I have this little stove that fits in this little box. It kind of pops out here. It runs on these little containers of isopro. And it just screws right into the top here. So this is just a little one burner stove. And people usually pair this with a cook pot. Sometimes people have something called a jet boil, which has serves the sole purpose of boiling water, but it does it pretty quickly and efficiently. I prefer a cook pot just for a little bit of versatility. So this is a little titanium pot that just sits right on here. I'm not going to light this because I'm inside. And this is how I boil water on the trail. This has some kind of measurements on the side, but I usually bring a water bottle, like a Nalgene bottle that has some measurements on the side. Most of those dehydrated meals say, add like a 2/3 cups of water, and that's the way that I measure that water is with my Nalgene. So I put the water in there, I boil it, and then you just pour the water into this package of dehydrated food. You also want to plan and make sure that you've got enough water. Um, Figuring out how much water you need each day is kind of a per person thing. People drink more water or less water than other people. Um, you might want to bring more water or plan to have more water on days where you might be on a long road walk where it's hot and unshaded. I also usually keep a separate water bottle away from my kind of main water supply, something like a reservoir, just as backup emergency water so I don't accidentally end up drinking all of my water. Any water that you get from somewhere along the trail, like a stream, you'll need to filter that water to remove any bacteria or anything that could make you sick. There are lots of different ways to filter water, lots of different water filters. I think the most popular is a Sawyer squeeze. I personally use something called a Grail. So it's kind of a water bottle that has a filter built into it. Um, there are lots and lots and lots of different filters. We can't really talk all about all of them. I think Erin's going to talk a little bit more about specific gear during her talk. So I'm going to skip past that for now. Very final route considerations are making sure that you know your route, read the map ahead of time. Don't rely on things like all trails, especially on the Finger Lakes Trail. Our trail changes all the time, and all trails doesn't necessarily know that. So the most up-to-date route is going to be directly from the Finger Lakes Trail Conference. So you definitely want to get those actual official maps from us from the Finger Lakes Trail Conference before you go. So let's talk a little bit about gear. Like I said before, Erin's going to talk a little bit more about specific gear during her talk, during part 2 of our backpacking series. But this is kind of a brief overview of some of the gear you might want to think about bringing with you. Let's look at it through the lens of the 10 essentials. So the 10 essentials are 10 categories that you need to think about and have kind of made preparations for before you go and do any outdoor activity. So I've adapted some of these for backpacking specifically as we go through. So those 10 categories are navigation, sun protection, insulation, illumination, first aid, fire, repair, nutrition, hydration, and shelter. So for navigation, I've added communication. Things that you can bring to help fulfill that category are things like a map and compass, a GPS system, maybe a digital map on your phone. And for the communication part, having a cell phone, some way to communicate with other people, especially for a solo trip. There are things called personal locator beacons, something like if you've ever heard people talk about like a Garmin InReach, or something with an SOS button. So a way to use satellite communication to let somebody know that you're in trouble. Walkie-talkies or things like leaving an itinerary, copy of your itinerary. So when you plan to start hiking, where you're starting hiking from, where you plan to spend each night, and where you're ending hiking, leaving a copy of that in your car and making sure that a friend knows where you are and also has a copy of that itinerary and has a time when they expect to hear from you. What I usually pack in my pack to fulfill this category are paper maps from the Finger Lakes Trail Conference, a compass. I usually have a digital copy of the map on my phone. I also sometimes make a custom GPX file from the GPX files you get as part of the digital map package. Um, Sometimes if I'm hiking with friends, I have a set of walkie-talkies so that if they want to hike ahead of me because I'm very, very slow, they can do that and I can still communicate with them while we're on the trail in case something goes wrong or I need to get in contact with them for some reason. And just make sure that you bring anything that you'll need to charge any device that you bring. So an external battery pack and the charging cables that you're going to need to connect that battery pack to that device, or something that needs just normal batteries, making sure that you have some extras. For sun protection, this is a little bit self-explanatory. So things like sunscreen, sunglasses, a hat, and sun protective clothing. I personally usually have UV protective quick dry t-shirt and hiking pants. I always wear sunscreen. I burn really, really easily and very, very quickly, so I'm pretty fastidious about reapplying sunscreen. Um, I usually bring some kind of lip balm that has SPF in it and pretty durable sunglasses that it's fine if I put them in my pack and then, that pack gets squished against a rock. I'm not worried that my sunglasses are going to break. For insulation, these are things like making sure that you have appropriate clothing for the weather. So things like bringing extra clothing layers if it is going to get cold, making sure that you have some kind of rain gear. If you want to have gloves, they can sometimes be helpful, especially on kind of cold mornings. Making sure that not only you are protected from the rain, but that your backpack and things that are in your backpack are protected from the rain as well. Um, I mean, some people tend to include sleeping bags and kind of sleep system stuff in this category. For now, I'm just going to move those to shelter category to keep things a little bit simpler. So for insulation for my pack, I usually bring a rain jacket, some kind of mid layer. So that's something that would go over my t-shirt, something like a fleece. I also bring a puffy insulated jacket and some kind of rain protection. So usually it's just my rain jacket. In cooler weather, I'll bring gloves, a lightweight towel to kind of dry things off if they happen to get wet or even just from condensation in the morning. So to dry off the outside of my tent before I have to put it back in my backpack. To keep stuff in my pack dry, things like the body of my tent and my sleeping bag, I'll put that in a trash compactor bag inside my backpack. And if it does start raining, I have a rain cover for the pack itself so that the pack doesn't get wet and start retaining water and make it even heavier and harder to lug around. For illumination, that's things like flashlights, lanterns, headlamps, anything that helps you see when it's dark. I usually bring a headlamp that has a red light setting. That helps to preserve our night vision, makes it a little bit easier to see at night once you turn that off. I prefer that my headlamp be one that just has normal batteries that I can swap in and out easily and not worry about having to charge it and having that charge take away from any charge that I have to charge my phone, all that fun stuff. But they do make rechargeable ones. They also make these kind of like light diffusing stuff sacks. So instead of lugging around a lantern for in the tent at night, I actually put my headlamp in one of those and hang it from the top of my tent so that it creates kind of more diffuse light and lights up the whole tent and not just kind of makes a spotlight down where the headlamp is dangling. For first aid, I'm also including hygiene in this category. So not only things like having a first aid kit with stuff that you know how to use in it, but things like having a trowel and toilet paper, hand sanitizer, having things like insect repellent, soap. I usually bring some wet wipes. They have these packs of single-use wet ones, which are really helpful for backpacking. It's really nice to be able to kind of get some of that sweat off of your face and body after a long day of backpacking before you get in your tent. And any medications you take regularly, things like that. For fire, this one is pretty self-explanatory and simple. Things like matches, fire starters, a lighter. I usually bring a small lighter, some emergency waterproof matches. And if I'm planning on making a campfire and I think it's going to be hard to find dry leaves or something else to make it a little easier to start a fire, I'll sometimes bring some sheets of newspaper as a lightweight way to have a couple of extra chances to be able to start that campfire. So repair and other tools. These are things that if something goes wrong with your gear, you have a chance of maybe fixing that. Things like scissors, duct tape, or gear repair tape. Some rope or string can sometimes be helpful. I once had one of the ties on a tent stake broke, and I had some extra string, so I was able to cut a little bit of string and make a new tie for it. And nutrition kind of comes back to food. So we talked a little bit about this already, but making sure that you have enough food, so that's meals for all the time that you're going to be out backpacking, plus one full day of extra food. I usually bring the dehydrated meals. The only thing I think we didn't talk too much about is trash. So make sure that you have a place that you're going to store any trash that you generate. I usually bring a couple of big gallon Ziploc bags, and any trash that has a scent, it's also something that you're going to want to put in your bear canister or in your bag that gets hoisted up into a bear hang. For hydration, this is water and everything to do with it. So any water you bring itself, plus things that you need to filter or purify any water from along the trail, and everything you need to carry that water. So I usually bring my water reservoir, a 1 liter Nalgene bottle, and my Grail, which I use for water filtration. And there's some weird special things that go along with having a Grail that you don't necessarily need for other methods of filtering water that I also bring. And finally, the last category is shelter, and I'm also including sleep in this. So these are kind of the big things that you think about when you're backpacking. So things like a tent, a sleeping bag, things like a sleeping pad, which can help insulate between you and the ground. So not only does it make sleeping on the ground a little bit more comfortable, it's really important because it actually keeps you warm at night by having you up off of the ground a little bit so that the ground isn't kind of stealing all of your heat. And other sleep things, thinking things like a pillow. I sometimes have a hard time sleeping out in the woods. So I'll sometimes bring an eye mask and even earplugs, and I'll plug one ear so that if there was some emergency, I could still hear, but so that every little teeny tiny nighttime wood sound doesn't wake me up and make my heart start racing like there's, some kind of creature near me, which there usually never is. Stuff that did not fit into any of those categories is your backpack itself. I usually bring trekking poles. They've helped me a lot with my knees. My knees aren't amazing, but having trekking poles, taking some of that weight from my pack, has actually helped a lot. Things like making sure you have appropriate footwear, especially socks. Some durable, quick dry socks are pretty important. I usually bring a journal and a pen and pencil, not only to just have a little bit of paper in case I need to write a note, but it's also a nice thing to be able to do, especially on a solo backpacking trip. Once I get to camp and I have a little bit of time. is kind of writing down some of the things that I experienced during the day of backpacking. Basic things like I bring my ID, my health insurance card, um, some cash, credit card, car and house keys, all that fun stuff. Um, Extra clothes is kind of a tricky one. I usually don't bring any extra shirt or pants. I usually bring some extra socks and some extra underwear, but I usually use the same shirt and pants for while I'm backpacking, just to help save on some of the things going into my backpack. Every single thing that you put in your backpack adds just a little bit more weight, and it's just one more thing that you have to carry through the woods. So I usually just wear the same shirt and pants. I will sometimes bring a different pair of shoes, like a lightweight pair of sandals, something like that, in case I need to make a water crossing so that I still have something covering my feet, but it's not the same shoes that I'm going to continue hiking in for the rest of the day. They're also nice to have at camp. Kind of sometimes putting on a different shoe can help um, relieve some like foot pain that you might have from the long day of hiking. Um, and some people, and me included on occasion, will bring something to sit on. Um, they make really lightweight chairs that you can bring on a backpacking trip, or even just a sit pad. So this kind of piece of foam that you put on the ground that just makes it a little bit more comfortable to sit on the ground and helps uh, you not get covered in leaves and dirt, especially if the ground is a little bit wet in the springtime. There's some guidelines about how much your backpack should weigh when it's fully loaded. It's kind of a rule of thumb that has some wiggle room in it. I've usually heard something like 20% of your body weight is kind of the maximum for what your backpack should weigh. There's also some resources on how to actually pack your backpack, where things should go in the pack, and how to distribute the weight correctly. So this is actually a link. So if you want to find these slides afterwards and click on that link, it's a nice video that tells you a little bit about how to pack your bag. Make sure that you've used your gear a little bit before you bring it on a backpacking trip. So you don't want the first time that you set up your tent to be while you're on that backpacking trip. Because if you realize that, oh, this tent didn't come with all of the stakes that it needs to be set up, that's something that you want to realize before you're out in the woods. Um, and when I'm thinking about what else to bring and making sure that I am thinking through everything and have everything on my list, I sometimes think about the ways that my gear could fail and what the ways that it's common for that piece of gear to fail, what would be really catastrophic if that went wrong, and what are some of the things I could bring to mitigate those effects. So for things like my tent, it might be, I guess the first thing you think of for a tent is what if the side of the tent gets ripped open by a really sharp thorn? That's when we bring gear repair tape, things like that. At the very end here, before we talk about questions, there is a photo submission form that the Finger Lakes Trail has. So if you have been backpacking on the FLT before, we would love to hear about it. We'd love to see your photos. We'd love to have your stories and hear your stories. And a great way to do that is with our photo submission form. So we have a link to that here. And the Finger Lakes Trail Conference is actually looking into guided backpacking trips. So we have our county hike series, but we're thinking a little bit about what it would be like if we guided some backpacking trips too. It's still in the planning stages, and we'll have a little bit more information coming here in the next few months. So if you aren't already subscribed to Footnotes, our email newsletter, stop at our website and subscribe to Footnotes. You can also follow us on social media. So we're on Instagram and Facebook. But I think we are ready to take a couple of questions. So one question we have in the chat is there ever an FLT shuttle for solo hikers like the Appalachian Trail has? We sometimes have shuttles for the county hike series and for organized trips. So when we hopefully do one of these organized backpacking trips, we'd have a shuttle for that. But I don't believe we have any official uh, shuttle like the Appalachian Trail has. We do have a car spotters list that our members have access to. But for for backpacking trips, if it's a lot of miles, that's usually something that we don't like to ask our car spotters to do. They're usually um, kind of car spotting is a little bit better suited for some of the smaller day hikes. Um, but people definitely ask about, you know, uh, kind of longer trips in some of the Facebook groups as well. And some of the other questions, let's see. Um, One of the questions is about sleeping bags or a quilt. Um, I don't have any personal experience with quilts. Um, they're so a sleeping bag, you're kind of enclosed within the bag. They do make kind of backpacking quilts where you're a little bit less enclosed. It's a little bit more like a bed you might have at home. I'm actually kind of interested in getting a quilt eventually. Um, you just want to make sure that it is properly rated for the temperatures that you might be experiencing. So if the quilt is rated at a comfort rating of 40 degrees, that might mean that it might not be quite adequate for some of the colder temperatures you might get in the really early spring and really late fall. Um, so that's just the only thing to be aware of, but that's kind of the same as you want to make sure of the same things when you're getting a sleeping bag. So I can't really speak to uh, whether you should get a sleeping bag or should get a quilt. It's kind of a personal preference sort of thing, as long as it meets the temperature requirements for the time and the area where you want to go backpacking. Um, any comments on courtesy in lean-to shelters, staying up late, music, smoking, etc.? I've only had one negative experience where folks were up until 1 in the morning gabbing. I have not had any negative experiences, but I've also never, other than people I brought backpacking with me, I have not yet had an experience staying in the same shelter as somebody or at the same campsite, other than when I stayed at Watkins Glen Campground. As there's, a whole bunch of sites there. So people, in RVs and things like that. Um, if you are going backpacking and staying anywhere, you definitely want to be respectful. So even if they're even with just people in your own group. So you don't want to be making a whole bunch of noise. You don't want to be staying up really, really late with a light on, shining in somebody's eyes, things like that. You just want to treat people the way that you would want to be treated. Um, I'm sorry that you have had a negative experience though. Aaron, did we have any other questions during the presentation? Did you see? Oh, and I do see we have one other question. I've considered going out to lean-tos and not bringing a tent with me, but wasn't sure if that's leaving too much to chance. What do you think about trusting lodging in that way? Uh, let's see. So you can fit a lot of people in a lean-to. I think most of them can fit at least 8 people. If everybody gets a little bit comfortable with each other. Um, I personally haven't really, again, so as for all of my backpacking trips, I really have not encountered that many people um, while I was backpacking, especially not people who were backpacking on the FLT. That doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't happen where a lean-to could be completely full, but I've been in some of the more popular areas too, and I haven't had that experience where there's even been even one other person in a lean-to. Um, you'd want to share the lean-to if other people show up, but for it filling up completely, I definitely haven't seen that happen. Aaron, have you ever heard of that happening anywhere along the FLT? Leaks and disrepair. So Aaron also hasn't had any experiences of a lean-to being completely full or anything. Um, but the question was more about kind of leaks and disrepair and things like that. We're in the process of updating a bunch of our lean-tos. I think one lean-to actually just got a whole new roof. But we have trail maintainers out working on these sorts of things. So if people ever come across a lean-to in complete disrepair, uh, you want to make sure that you file a trail report about it so that we can repair it. But uh, yes, and the other thing, Aaron just said a really great point. So the Facebook group Friends and Hikers of the Finger Lakes Trail, I think it's called, is a really good resource to ask and double check. So the likelihood of somebody having just hiked past that lean-to and seen that it's in great condition uh, is pretty high that someone has been by there pretty recently and can let you know. One other question was, do bear canisters come in various sizes? They do. My bear canister is really, really small. I think this is maybe the smallest size that this particular company makes. So it's really nice for me as one person to go out for a couple of days or just one overnight for a couple of people. But they make ones that go, up lots and lots in sizes. So it's nice to have. I think REI also rents bear canisters. So if you don't want to buy a bunch of bear canisters to always have the exact right size of bear canister, depending on the length of the trip that you want to go on, that's a good resource. And coordinating with friends, if they're trying to buy a bear canister, you can kind of start a little bear canister exchange, things like that. And Todd says, I have the big version of that. It fits perfectly in my 65-liter backpack and it's 2.2 pounds. Awesome. I think mine is also 65 liters. But yeah, if I was going on a longer trip, I'd probably want a bigger bear canister. So I might end up going with that same big version that Todd has. Kathy asks, does anyone know if uh, the REI in Ithaca rents bear canisters? The one in Rochester definitely does. I don't know specifically about the one in Ithaca. I think they might also have a listing on their website. That's how I found out about REI in Rochester here renting bear canisters. Um, they should have a listing on their website where they say what they rent at that specific store. Righty. Well, it looks like we are just about at the end of our hour here. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming and for sticking with me, sitting through a couple of minutes of me silently talking at a camera here at the beginning. Very much appreciated. And we hope you come back for part two, where Aaron's going to talk a little bit more about gear and about safety on the trail and all that uh, awesome, really important stuff, and kind of continue our conversation. We hope to put this on our YouTube channel. So we recorded our presentation today. We'll put it up on our YouTube channel, and we'll also put in the comments the same link to those same slides. Thanks everybody for coming, and hope to see you again in January.